Mom, why does that man look exactly like us?
Because 6 years ago, he chose to forget we ever existed.
No, that's impossible.
Mom, is he our dad?
Tell them.
4 boys turned around in a hallway mirror, and I stopped breathing. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I know how it sounds. A man staring at 4 children in a mirror doesn't sound like the beginning of anything, but it was the beginning of everything. It was the moment my whole life split into before and after, and I didn't even know it yet. I just knew my chest had gone tight and my hands had gone cold, and somewhere underneath the panic, a voice in me was already whispering the truth before I was ready to hear it. I think a lot of us go through life assuming the worst thing that could happen to us is something we can see coming. A diagnosis, a phone call in the middle of the night, a door closing behind someone we love. Nobody warns you that sometimes the worst thing and the best thing walks up to you in a hallway wearing a school uniform and just looks at you like it already knows exactly who you are. Wherever you're watching this from, I hope you're sitting somewhere comfortable, because this one is long and it is not gentle. If it's raining where you are, good, that fits. If the sun's out, that's fine too. Either way, stay with me to the end. I promise you it earns every minute. My name is Julian Baek, and this is the story of how I found out, on the day I was supposed to promise my life to one woman, that I already belonged to 4 boys and a woman I thought I had lost forever. By the time this story ends, I will have walked away from a business empire waiting to be handed to me, stood in a courtroom in front of my own mother, and knelt on a pavement asking a woman who owed me nothing to let me try again. But that's the end. Let me start where it actually began, because none of what happened later makes sense unless you understand who I used to be. If this story is landing for you already, do me a favor and hit subscribe before we go further, because I promise there is a lot more coming, and you don't want to miss where this leads. I was 26 years old when I still believed the world worked in straight lines. Work hard, keep your word, and things resolve themselves fairly. I believed loyalty was rewarded. I believed my mother's decisions, even the ones I didn't understand, were made with good reason, because that was the only version of her I had ever been allowed to see. I believed that if you truly loved someone, the people around you would eventually come to love them too, given enough time. I had a lot of beliefs at 26. Most of them were about to be proven wrong. There was a woman who worked in our household back then. She managed the kitchen staff, kept the estate running in ways nobody upstairs ever noticed or thanked her for, and she had a way of talking to me like I was a person instead of an heir. I didn't understand yet how rare that was. I didn't understand a lot of things yet. What I did understand even then was that my mother watched the way I looked at her a little too closely for it to be nothing. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself a lot of things back then. I was wrong about that too. And in a few minutes, you're going to understand exactly how wrong and exactly what it cost. Her name was Amara, and she came to work in my family's household the year I turned 22, fresh out of business school and pretending I already knew everything there was to know about running a life. She'd come from a smaller city, the kind of background my mother's friends only mentioned in passing, usually followed by a comment about resourcefulness that was never actually a compliment. Amara didn't care. She moved through that house like she owned every corner of it, not with arrogance, just with the quiet certainty of someone who refused to shrink herself to fit anyone else's comfort. I noticed her the way you notice weather changing, slowly, and then all at once. She ran the kitchen and half the household logistics my mother never bothered learning herself, and she did it without ever once asking for credit. The staff respected her. My father, when he was still alive, used to say she was the only person in that house who ever told him the truth about anything, including the state of his own health. I started finding reasons to be near the kitchen. She started finding reasons to let me stay. Neither of us said it out loud for months, because we both understood exactly what it would mean if we did. A man like me, from a family like mine, and a woman who worked for us. We both knew the shape of that story before we ever lived it. We thought we could be the exception. The first time she really talked to me, not the polite deferential talk she gave everyone upstairs, but actual conversation, was over a burnt pot of rice she refused to throw away. She said wasting food was the one thing she couldn't forgive, not in a kitchen, not in a life. I asked her what else she couldn't forgive. She looked at me for a long moment and said dishonesty, plain and simple, the kind where people let you believe something false because the truth was inconvenient for them. I didn't know yet how much that sentence would come to define both our lives. We fell into something real over the better part of a year, quiet dinners after the house had gone to sleep, long conversations in the garden where she taught me things about resilience that no business school ever could. She'd grown up with far less than I had and carried herself with more dignity than anyone I'd ever met. And next to her, I started to understand how small and sheltered my own version of struggle actually was. My mother, Sujin, noticed everything. She always did. She never confronted me directly, not at first. She was more surgical than that. She started finding reasons Amara needed to work later shifts, reasons her responsibilities kept expanding, while her presence in rooms I occupied kept shrinking. I told myself it was coincidence. Amara knew better. She'd survived enough rooms like that one to recognize the shape of a warning long before I could. She doesn't like people who don't know their place, Amara told me once. Not bitter, just matter of fact, the way you'd describe weather. The problem is, I've never once believed I had one. I told her my mother would come around. I told her love made people flexible eventually. I believed it when I said it. I want you to remember that, because it matters later, how much I believed the people around me were operating in good faith. It's a specific kind of ignorance, the kind that only wealth and protection can manufacture, and I carried it like armor, without ever noticing how heavy it was. There was a night, maybe 8 months into whatever we were building, when Amara sat across from me in the garden and told me plainly that she was falling for me, and she was terrified of it. Not because of anything I'd done, but because she had watched enough families like mine decide, always eventually, that people like her were temporary, useful, never permanent. I told her she was wrong about that. I told her I would prove it. I meant every word. I had no idea yet that the proving was going to cost both of us more than I could have imagined, and that when it mattered most, I was going to fail her completely without even realizing I'd done it. Act 3, the morning everything ended, started like any other. I found out later it had actually started weeks earlier, in conversations I was never invited to, decisions made in rooms I wasn't standing in. That's the thing about the people who control your life quietly. By the time you notice the walls moving, they've already finished building the new shape of your world. My mother called me into her study on a Tuesday. She had tea prepared, which should have warned me. Sujin only served tea personally when she was about to say something she wanted remembered exactly the way she delivered it. She told me Amara had resigned. Said it plainly, no preamble, watching my face the entire time for a reaction she'd clearly already prepared herself to manage. She said Amara had found a better opportunity in another city, that she'd left a letter, that these things happened, staff moved on, and it was best not to make more of it than it was. I remember the specific stillness that came over me, not disbelief exactly, something colder. A recognition maybe that the ground I'd been standing on had never been as solid as I'd assumed. I asked to see the letter. My mother said she'd already had it filed away, that it wasn't anything remarkable, standard notice, nothing personal in it worth revisiting. I asked for Amara's new address, her number, anything. My mother told me, with the particular gentle firmness she used when she wanted a conversation finished, that chasing after household staff wasn't becoming of someone in my position, and that whatever I imagined had existed between us had likely meant far less to her than I'd convinced myself it had. I want to be honest with you about something. I believed her. Not completely. not without a knot of wrongness sitting low in my chest that never fully went away, but enough. Enough to not push harder. Enough to let a week pass, then a month, then let myself get swallowed back into the schedule my life had always run on. I told myself Amara had made a choice. I told myself people leave for opportunities all the time, and love that's real survives that. And if it didn't survive, maybe it hadn't been what I thought. I searched, eventually. Not hard enough, not soon enough, but I did try, quietly, over the following year. I hired someone to look. He came back with nothing because Amara had done exactly what she needed to do to disappear from a family, with the resources to find anyone they truly wanted found. I didn't understand then how thorough that disappearance actually was, or what had driven her to make it so complete. What I didn't know, what nobody told me, was that Amara hadn't left because of a better opportunity. She'd been given an ultimatum days after my mother discovered how far things between us had actually gone. Leave quietly, take a settlement, and never make contact again, or my mother would ensure she never found stable work in this city again, and would make her life difficult in ways that went far beyond employment. Amara had no family with money, no safety net, nothing behind her but her own resolve. She took the settlement. She left. She never told me the real reason, because by the time she was forced to decide, my mother had made it clear that if Amara tried to explain herself to me directly, the consequences would only get worse for her. I didn't know any of that yet. I only knew the ache of something ending without an explanation I could trust, and the slow, quiet way I let myself move on, because moving on was easier than sitting with a wound I didn't understand. 2 years later, my mother introduced me to Shin Myeon, a merger disguised as a match, the daughter of a family whose business interests aligned neatly with ours. Myeon was intelligent, composed, and genuinely kind in the moments I allowed myself to notice her, and over the following years, I convinced myself that comfort was close enough to love. We built something steady, not passionate but functional. My mother approved completely, which should have told me something about how low the bar for her approval actually was when it came to my happiness. 4 years after Amara vanished, I proposed to Myeon in front of both our families over a dinner that felt more like a shareholder meeting than an engagement. She said yes. Everyone applauded. I remember feeling something that resembled relief more than joy, the specific relief of a man who has finally stopped fighting a current he no longer had the energy to resist. We planned the wedding for 18 months out. A gala first, a formal engagement announcement in front of 200 guests, the kind of event that exists less to celebrate love and more to confirm alliances. I threw myself into planning it the way I threw myself into everything by then, competently, without any particular feeling attached to it. I had no idea that 6 years after Amara disappeared, on the afternoon of that exact engagement gala, I was going to walk into a restaurant bathroom and find 4 small boys washing their hands at the sink beside mine, and that within 5 minutes, everything I'd built my adult life on top of was going to collapse into something unrecognizable. I didn't know it yet, but I want you to know it now, because everything I'm about to tell you happens in the space of that single afternoon, and once it starts, there is no version of my life that goes back to how it was before. The restaurant was called Han's Table, a mid-range place near the district where the gala venue sat, the kind of spot my assistant had picked because it was quiet enough for a working lunch before the evening's chaos began. I was there with 2 members of my legal team, finalizing details on a licensing agreement that had nothing to do with anything that mattered, though at the time I thought it did. I excused myself to wash my hands before we wrapped up. I remember exactly nothing remarkable about walking into that bathroom. That's the part that still gets me, looking back. The most important 5 minutes of my life started with something as forgettable as running water over my hands. 4 boys came in behind me, still in school uniforms. backpacks half slipping off their shoulders, moving with the specific synchronized chaos of children who've spent their entire lives doing everything together without needing to discuss it first. They took the sinks beside mine without paying me any attention at all. I didn't look up either. My mind was still on contract language. They washed their hands the way I imagine most children do, quickly, without much patience for thoroughness, and then, without any of them looking at each other first, all four of them ran wet hands back through their hair in the exact same motion, front to back, one clean sweep, a small shake of the head after. I looked up because the motion caught the corner of my eye, and what I saw in the mirror stopped every thought in my head at once. Four small faces, staring back at their own reflections with the same gesture I'd made with my own hands since I was younger than any of them, a gesture nobody had ever taught me. A gesture I'd always assumed was simply mine, private, meaningless to anyone but me, the kind of tic a person carries without ever examining it. One of them noticed me looking. He tilted his head, studying my hair, then his own, then his brother's, with the plain confusion of a child encountering something that doesn't add up. He asked me, not rudely, just curious, why I was copying them. I told him I wasn't copying anyone. I told him I'd done this since I was small, long before he existed. And the four of them looked at each other, fast, wordless, complete, the way people who've spent their whole lives reading each other look at things nobody else would catch. Then they said, together, without any prompting at all, that they did too. I want you to understand what that felt like from the inside. 30 years of carrying a habit I thought belonged only to me, and in the space of 10 seconds, 4 strangers had just told me it was theirs as well. I told myself it was coincidence. Children mimic things. Maybe they'd seen someone else do it, absorbed it somewhere, some teacher, some uncle, some stranger none of us would ever trace. I told myself that standing at a sink, staring at 4 reflections that all had the same dimple carved into the same cheek at the same depth I'd had mine since birth. One of the boys, the smallest and clearly the boldest of the 4, told me their mother worked at the restaurant and that I should come meet her. I said I had a meeting. He shrugged, entirely unbothered by my refusal, and they were gone as quickly as they'd arrived, leaving me alone with a mirror and a feeling I didn't have language for yet. I went back to my table. I picked up the document in front of me and read the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing a single word. Something had cracked open in me that I couldn't close back up, and after 20 minutes of pretending otherwise, I stood, told my team I needed a moment, and walked back through the restaurant. I found the boys near the back, weaving through tables toward a woman kneeling in front of the restaurant manager, and I understood, before I even fully processed her face, that I already knew her. Amara knelt on that floor with her hands clasped in front of a man who had clearly already decided her answer before she finished asking her question. I caught fragments, evicted that morning, just one night, somewhere safe for her children to sleep. The manager stood with his arms folded, unmoved, and walked away before she'd finished speaking. Then the boys reached her, and every hard edge in her posture dissolved at once. She gathered all 4 of them into her arms like they were the only solid thing left in a room that had gone sideways underneath her, and she was laughing within seconds, warm and unguarded, like the humiliation she'd just endured hadn't touched her at all. Then she looked up and saw me, and the laugh stopped like a held breath. 6 years, she had spent every one of them making sure this exact moment never happened, and there I was, standing in the one restaurant in the city she hadn't managed to avoid. She didn't say a word. She turned her sons gently but firmly away from me and walked them out of the room without looking back once. I stood in the middle of that restaurant and understood all at once, with a clarity that made my knees genuinely unsteady, that I had spent 6 years searching cities I didn't need to search, because the woman I loved had been 20 minutes from my own front door the entire time, raising 4 sons who carried my face, while I planned an engagement to someone else. I canceled the gala from my table before I'd even stood up. My coordinator asked why. I told her to handle it however she needed to and hung up before she could push further. Then I found my driver and told him to locate the woman who'd just left with 4 boys, because I needed to speak to her before she disappeared from my life a second time. By the time I found her outside, she was on the pavement with her phone against her ear, working through a list of names she'd clearly already called and recalled a dozen times that day, her sons arranged around her the way children arrange themselves when they can read a crisis without needing it explained to them. One boy was already asleep against his own backpack. Another had his head tipped against the wall behind him, eyes open but somewhere far away. I didn't say anything about the boys yet. I didn't trust myself to. I told her I had an empty apartment, that my driver would take her, that she didn't need to speak to me or see me again that night, only that her sons needed somewhere safe to sleep. She told me no, firmly, finally, the kind of no that had 6 years of practice behind it. I didn't argue. I'd learned enough about her, even back then, to know that pushing only made a woman like Amara dig in harder. I simply waited, the card still in my hand, until she looked at her sons one more time, at the exhaustion written into all 4 small faces, and made a decision I could see cost her something to make. She took the card without looking at me. She said thank you in a voice that had nothing warm left in it, and got into the car with her sons, and I stood on that pavement long after they'd disappeared into traffic, finally understanding that the gala I'd just cancelled had never meant anything to me at all, and the family waiting in the back of that car might be the only thing that ever had. The apartment I sent her to belonged to me, one of several properties I owned and rarely used, sitting empty on the higher floors of a building downtown. I didn't go there that night. I understood, even in the state I was in, that showing up myself would only confirm every fear she'd spent 6 years building walls against. Instead, I sat in my own place, staring at a phone I kept picking up and putting back down, and let the weight of everything I'd just learned settle into me slowly, instead of all at once. 4 sons, 6 years, a woman who had built an entire life out of nothing, 20 minutes from where I slept every night, while I searched cities she'd never set foot in. I texted her once before midnight, nothing demanding, just a line asking if the boys were settled. She didn't answer. I told myself that was fair. I told myself a lot of things that first night, most of them attempts to talk myself out of the guilt that had already started working its way into every quiet moment. The next morning it was raining hard enough that I knew, without needing to be told, that 4 boys taking 2 buses to school was not something I could sit with. I sent a message telling her my driver would be outside at 7:30. She wrote back that they could manage. I told her they'd mentioned the 2 buses themselves, unprompted, the day before. She sent back a single word, okay. That one word felt like more progress than anything else that entire week. I met them properly for the first time 2 days later, at the school gate, holding 4 boxes from a bakery, 2 streets from where they used to live. I'd learned from the boys themselves, during a short conversation neither of them realized was information gathering, that it had been their birthday that week and that their mother had promised them a proper cake she hadn't yet been able to deliver on. I didn't know yet which one liked which flavor, so I bought one of each. I crouched down and handed them over, and the boy who'd asked me in the bathroom why I was copying him looked at the box like I'd handed him something far more significant than cake. "You remembered," he said, genuinely stunned. "I told you, and you actually remembered." I told him I remembered everything he'd told me. I meant it as something small. His face told me it had landed as something much larger. That was the same morning another child near the gate, one of their classmates, said something loud enough to carry across the wet pavement about them being the family without a father. I watched all 4 of my sons absorb it in 4 completely different ways. one straightening his shoulders like armor, one going rigid at the jaw, one dropping his eyes to the ground, and the smallest one going suddenly and completely still. I told that boy, calmly, clearly, in front of everyone standing there, that I was their father. No performance in it. I wasn't trying to make a scene. I was simply done letting a lie about my own children stand uncorrected in front of them. Amara's voice found me before the words had even finished settling over the crowd. She told me, flat and low, never to say something like that to them again, and walked off toward the main road without looking back. I understood her anger even as it cut through me. She had spent 6 years building a version of the truth that protected her sons from disappointment, and I just detonated it in a single sentence without asking her permission first. I stood there a long time after she left, my hand drifting to the back of my own neck without my deciding it should, and got back in my car with the specific ache of a man who'd done something right in the worst possible way. She found a room of her own within days, refusing every offer of help I made, paying for it herself out of whatever she'd managed to save. I respected that more than I told her at the time. I started sending lunches to the boys' school instead, no name attached, until the front desk called her directly to ask, and she must have known immediately who was behind it, because the boxes kept arriving and she never once asked me to stop. I started walking them home in the afternoons, all 4 of them, asking me questions with the relentless curiosity only children have, whether I owned a dog, whether I could fly a plane, whether I'd ever been to Nigeria, where their mother's family was from. I answered every question honestly, turning some of them back on the boys, which they seemed to find endlessly satisfying. Amara walked alongside us during these afternoons, watchful, careful, saying very little, though I noticed the distance between us narrowing by inches each week, whether either of us admitted it or not. It was one of the boys, the quiet, observant one, who first asked his mother outright whether she liked me. She told him I was a kind person. He told her, with the plain directness only a child gets away with, that wasn't what he'd asked, and went back to his ice cream without pushing further, though the question sat in the air long after he'd let it go. Meanwhile, in a part of my life I'd almost stopped thinking about entirely, Mion had noticed everything shifting. 3 weeks of silence after a cancelled gala with no real explanation, my schedule rearranging itself around hours she couldn't account for. She wasn't a fool, and she wasn't someone who waited patiently for answers to arrive on their own. She hired someone to find out exactly what I'd been doing with my afternoons, and by the time his report landed on her desk, it contained everything. My name connected to a woman who had once worked in my mother's household, 4 boys who resembled me in every photograph the investigator had managed to collect, a story that answered every question she'd been quietly circling for weeks. She sat with that folder longer than I ever knew at the time. And somewhere in that same stretch of days, 2 boys let something slip to me that I wasn't supposed to know yet, something about a night on the floor of an apartment, their mother crying quietly over a photograph she thought nobody was awake to see. When I asked Amara about it directly, she told me plainly, with a steadiness I could tell cost her something, that she was still legally married, separated but never divorced, that the boys had a father, and it wasn't me. I watched her say it and understood, with complete clarity, that she didn't believe a word of what she just told me any more than I did. But I also understood, in that same moment, that whatever she was protecting herself from wasn't finished unfolding yet, and that the next revelation waiting for both of us was going to cost more than either of us had prepared for. I asked her, gently, if there was more to what she'd just told me. She looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that weighs whether a person has earned the truth yet, and told me to walk ahead with her, while the boys trailed behind, pretending badly not to listen. She told me she was going to prove, once and for all, that the boys weren't mine. Before I could respond, she reached up and pulled a single strand of hair from my head, dropped it into a small envelope she'd clearly been carrying for exactly this moment, and told me she'd have it tested. I let her do it. I understood, even then, that this wasn't really about proving anything to me. It was about her keeping one last door open to close it herself, on her own terms, before anyone else could close it for her. What I didn't know, what she never told me, was that she had already decided the outcome before that hair ever left my head. She had a second envelope waiting, a sample from a hairbrush belonging to nobody connected to either of us, and it was that sample, not mine, that was going into the lab. She'd made the decision alone one night after the boys had gone to sleep, sitting on the floor with the weight of everything she'd carried for 6 years, finally catching up to her all at once. If the test came back negative, I would stop showing up. The boys would stop learning to need a man who could just as easily be taken from them the way everything else in her life had eventually been taken. She would not watch her sons build hope around someone only to lose him too. I understood none of that yet. I only knew she'd walked away with a piece of me in an envelope and a look on her face like she'd already made peace with whatever came next. Mion called me that same week and asked to meet. I assumed, wrongly, that it was about wedding logistics we hadn't yet formally cancelled. Instead, she set a folder on the table between us and told me she already knew everything: the restaurant, the boys, Amara's name, her history in my mother's household. The 6 years she'd spent disappeared from a family with more than enough resources to have found her sooner, if anyone involved had actually wanted to. I sat with that folder a long time. Mion watched me read it without saying anything else, and when I finally looked up, I saw something in her face I hadn't expected. Not fury, grief. The specific grief of a woman realizing that 2 years of her life had been spent standing outside a door that had never actually been opened to her. "You never once fully let me in," she said quietly. "I always thought that was just who you were." I didn't have an answer for her that didn't sound like an excuse. I told her I was sorry, and I meant it, though I understood the apology couldn't undo 2 years she'd spent building a future with a man who'd never stopped loving someone else. She left that meeting with more dignity than I probably deserved from her, and I went home that night to sit with the second piece of the week's devastation, the one that had nothing to do with Mion at all. My mother called me to the house 3 days later. I found her waiting at the dining table with tea already gone cold, and I understood before she said a single word that whatever was coming had been sitting in her for a long time, waiting for the right moment to finally surface. She told me everything, in order, without softening a single piece of it. 6 years earlier, she'd discovered what was happening between Amara and me, and within that same week she'd ended Amara's employment herself, packed her belongings personally, handed her a month's salary, and told her to leave the city. She told me afterward that Amara had chosen to go on her own. That was a lie, she said flatly, like tearing off something that had been stitched into her for years. Weeks after Amara left, my mother learned she was pregnant. She sent someone to Amara's door with an ultimatum: end the pregnancy, and the family would cover the cost in full. Refuse, and she would receive nothing from us, ever. No support, no acknowledgement, nothing. Amara went to the clinic. At the final moment, she couldn't go through with it. She left before the procedure began, and by the time my mother's people went looking for her afterward, she had already vanished completely, leaving no address, no number, nothing to follow. I assumed there were no children, my mother said quietly. There were 4 of them, I told her, my voice barely holding steady. Raised in one room, in this same city, while you arranged my engagement and said nothing. Yes, she said, I did exactly that. I stood and walked to the window and stood there a long time with my back to her, breathing through something I didn't have words for yet. She didn't try to soften it further. She let me sit with the full, uncomfortable weight of what she'd done, because for the first time in my life, She understood she owed me that much. When I finally turned back to her, I told her exactly what was going to happen next. She would go to Amara herself, in person, and repeat every word of what she'd just told me without softening any of it. And then, only then, she would ask, not tell, what Amara actually wanted from her now. Whatever Amara decided would be final, and there would be no further discussion of it afterward. My mother agreed without hesitation, and I understood, watching her, that some part of her had been waiting 6 years for someone to finally make her say all of it out loud. I had no idea, walking out of that house, that within the same week, Amara's closest friend was going to do something that would rip this story out of our hands entirely and put it in front of the whole city, or that Mion, still raw from everything she'd just learned, was about to make a decision of her own that would put one of my sons in real danger. My mother went to Amara's apartment 2 days later, alone, without telling me she was going. Amara let her stand in the doorway long enough to look past her into the small room, 4 narrow beds, drawings pinned above each one, before either of them said a word. My mother repeated everything exactly as she'd told me, the firing, the lie, the ultimatum at the clinic door, 6 years of silence she'd justified to herself as necessary. When she finished, Amara asked her simply if that was everything. It was. Then leave, Amara told her, and understand this completely. You do not come near my sons again, not at their school, not here, not anywhere, until I decide otherwise. My mother agreed immediately, without asking for softer terms, because she understood none had been offered. I thought, foolishly, that the worst of it was behind us. I had no idea Amara's friend Clara had already made a call of her own that was going to take this entire story out of everyone's hands. Clara worked with Amara at the restaurant and had known the full truth for years, longer than anyone else alive. She told Amara later, in a rush of guilt she could barely get through, that she'd sent everything to a journalist she trusted, believing that if the truth came out properly, on Amara's own terms, nobody could ever use it against her later. The cancelled engagement, the 4 boys, who their father was. 6 years of history, laid out in full. By morning it was everywhere. My name beside a woman nobody had heard of. 4 boys who looked unmistakably like me, in photographs taken from careful distances outside their school. Someone had been watching them far longer than any of us realized. By the time Amara reached the school gate that morning, there were 6 photographers waiting, calling her name, calling her sons' names like they were already public property. She called me from the pavement, her voice gone cold and level, in a way that frightened me more than shouting would have. There had been cameras outside her children's school, she said. Fix it, all of it. Today I made calls. I contained what I could and failed to contain the rest. Because a story like that one doesn't stay quiet once it's loose, and every day brought fresh coverage, fresh speculation, fresh photographs. The boys adapted in their own ways, one giving the cameras nothing, one staring them down with practiced indifference, one ignoring them entirely, and the smallest one waving cheerfully at a man with a long lens across the street, a moment Amara chose not to address. Neon watched all of this unfold from a distance I didn't fully understand the danger of until it was almost too late. She had offered Amara money to disappear again, quietly, before any of this became public. A clean start somewhere far away, a position, a house, everything arranged. Amara had refused every part of it, standing in that same small room, telling her plainly that someone had already once made a decision about her body and her children's lives without her consent, and she would not disappear a second time for anyone's convenience. Mion had waited after that, watching the public mood shift slowly from scandal toward something closer to sympathy, watching me show up every single day for children who had grown up entirely without me, and something in her had kept tightening the longer she watched it. She told me herself much later that she had genuinely convinced herself in that state that she wasn't someone who hurt children, that whatever she was about to do had a limit she believed she could control. She made a call on a Tuesday night that put one of my sons on the back of a stranger's plan to take him from a school bus between stops. Amara noticed nothing wrong that Wednesday morning. She watched all 4 boys board as usual and went on to her shift until 3 missed calls from the school reached her during a break. 3 of the boys had arrived safely. The 4th was nowhere to be found. I met her outside the school within minutes of her call, and I told her, not as comfort, as fact, that I was going to find our son. She looked at me and told me one word, low enough that only I could hear it. Mion. She explained in short, controlled sentences that Mion was the one person left with nothing more to lose. And something in me went cold with the recognition of a fear I'd been quietly hoping was wrong the entire time. I drove myself, my security team tracking a location within the hour, a quiet side street where whoever Mion had hired had taken him. I was still minutes away when another car came through an intersection I never saw coming, and the last thing I remember before everything went dark was the sound of impact and the world tilting sideways all at once. I woke up in a hospital bed with a dressing over one eye, and the first word out of my mouth, before I'd even fully placed the ceiling above me, was my son's name. Amara was there. She told me they'd found him, safe, completely unharmed, already on his way back to her. I let my eyes close again and allowed myself, finally, to believe it. He'd been kept in a locked room for 2 days, spoken to carefully by whoever Mion had hired, never harmed the way she'd insisted on when she gave the order, but frightened in a way no 6-year-old should ever have to carry. When he came home, he was clutching a small gray button he'd found somewhere in that room and held on to the entire time, something to keep his hands busy while he waited. He told his mother he'd kept it safe. She laughed before she could stop herself and gathered up every part of all 4 of her sons that she could reach at once, right there on the pavement outside their building. My own mother arrived at the hospital that same afternoon, already aware of what Mion had done, and admitted standing beside my bed that Mion had been asking her careful questions for weeks about my schedule and the boys' routines, and that she'd answered them, never once suspecting what was actually being built out of her own innocent responses. Whatever connection remained between our families and Mion, she said, ended that day. It isn't me you need to say that to, Amara told her, and my mother nodded and said nothing more. Mion left the city 3 days later. The engagement was formally dissolved through a short public statement that said almost nothing and somehow communicated everything anyone needed to understand. I sat across from her exactly once before she left, and I described to her, as plainly as I could manage, a 6-year-old who had spent 2 days alone in a locked room holding a button because it was the only thing he had left to hold on to. She didn't argue with anything I said. She simply stood and walked away, and I never saw her again after that. I was discharged 3 days later. Amara was there without having planned to be, she told me later, insisting the night before that she'd only send a simple text and nothing more, and then finding herself in a car heading to the hospital anyway. The boys met us in the hallway, all talking over each other at once, and the oldest one looked at the dressing over my eye, set his hand briefly on my arm, and walked off to put his bag away without another word. That was, for him, the closest thing to saying he was glad I was alive that he had in him. Amara laid a blanket out on the sofa that night without much ceremony and told me to rest. I lay there a long while listening to 4 boys breathing through the thin wall beside me and felt, for the first time in 6 years, like I was finally exactly where I was supposed to be. The next morning I told her everything plainly, without softening a single part of it. That 6 years ago I'd believed a lie because it was easier than pushing harder for the truth. That she had spent 6 years entirely alone because of my own failure to search for her properly. That I understood now exactly what had been done to her, and there was no undoing a single moment of it, but I was asking her to let me stay, not for a day, for all of it, for as long as she'd allow. She told me honestly that she didn't trust easily anymore, not because of me specifically, but because of everything it had taken simply to survive what had happened to her. The boys already trusted me completely, and that mattered more than I probably understood. But she needed real time, not promises. Ask me again in 6 months, she said. 6 months passed, and a great deal quietly rearranged itself in that time. The boys began attending a school funded by my family's foundation, the same one I'd walked through as a child, close enough to my mother's estate that a new rhythm settled into place without anyone formally deciding it. They stayed with her through the week and came back to Amara every weekend, and Amara herself went back to finish the degree she'd abandoned 6 years earlier, sitting in lecture halls with the nervous focus of someone determined not to waste a second chance. I showed up every single day I could, not to perform reliability, just to actually be it, the way genuinely dependable things simply are, without needing to announce themselves. One Saturday afternoon, the boys teased their mother mercilessly for checking her phone every few minutes, waiting for me to arrive, and told her outright to just call her husband. She corrected them, flustered, and all 4 of them dissolved into laughter, delighted at having caught her. When I walked through the door minutes later, out of breath and apologizing for traffic, I found 4 small, smug faces lined up on the sofa, and understood immediately, watching Amara's face, exactly what I'd walked into. We stood in that small kitchen after the boys had gone, and for the first time in longer than either of us could easily measure, being in a room together felt like exactly what it was. Not careful, not managed, just ours. If you made it this far with me, thank you for sitting through all of it. If this story moved you even a little, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if you haven't yet, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because there are more stories like this coming, and I promise you they hit just as hard.